The Year of Faith, celebrating 50 years of Vatican II, is a production of CTNY, the Catholic television network of Youngstown. It seeks to share important information on the documents of the Second Vatican Council and how they shaped and changed the life of the Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Korda and Father Jeffrey Mickler.
Hello and welcome to our show, Year of Faith, celebrating 50 years of Vatican II. I'm Father Jim Korda.
And I'm Father Jeffrey Mickler of the Society of St. Paul.
Today we welcome to our show Sister Mary McCorrmick. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And our topic today is on religious life. And before we get into our discussion, we're going to turn it over to our resident expert, Father Mickler, to give us some brief insight and overlook of the document itself. Father Jeff?
Well, first of all, religious life has a long and rich history of 1,500 years, starting with St. Benedict and St. Augustine. There's orders, congregations, and societies of monks and nuns, sisters, brothers, priests, people living in community, following poverty, chastity, and obedience, in order to serve God's people in one mission or another. Religious life really has been the backbone not only of the Church, but of civilization and its universities, its hospitals, its service to the poor over the centuries. At the Vatican Council, the bishops wanted to encourage a revitalization of religious life and a reorientation for the future. And they invited the congregations and societies to look at the scriptures, their founders, their histories, to remove what was non-essential and perhaps inhibiting their growth and their development, and to start anew living the evangelical counsels in service of the people of God. Sister, you have a long life of service in the Church. What do you think motivated the bishops to give this challenge to religious life? What were some of the limitations, perhaps, that they saw, and some of the things they wanted to encourage in the various congregations?
Well, it's interesting because probably the 1950s, especially in our country, saw such a large growth of religious communities. And yet I think on the part of the bishops there was a sense of how do we, and this was kind of the vision of John the 23rd, how do we bring religious life as well as all of the Church into the modern era? And so there was a sense of, even though these congregations and orders and communities had been founded, as long as 1,500 years ago, some of them, many in existence today, were founded in the 18th and 19th century. How do we bring them into the late 20th century and then into the early 21st century?
When we talk about religious life, obviously the word that is so prevalent is community.
Right.
And that whole sense that religious live in communion with one another. And how is that then in the document translated to living in communion with the world or with others outside of their own particular community?
That whole idea of community really has its source in the Acts of the Apostles. Right after the Pentecost story and early in the Acts of the Apostles, the author of the Acts talks about the fact that all of the Christians lived in one mind and one heart. Now, of course, that's followed immediately by people who didn't get along with the community, which is pretty realistic too. But I think what happens in religious communities is people who have a strong desire to follow God and to follow God very closely and to really live the gospel message, also are attracted to a particular spirituality and or a particular way of serving God. And so, also depending on who they know, they find themselves living with other like-minded people. And it's these individuals who have their own personalities, who also have such a desire to follow God, that they do live in common life together and have this similar vision, similar mission, and take on the spirituality of one of the great saints of the Church in order to love God and to serve God's people.
Community life is both the strength and also the challenge to all of us. One pundit rightly observed that community life is like living with all of your relatives all at once. You love them all, but it could be quite tense, but that very tension challenges each individual to grow in service and love both of one another and of the people of God as a whole.
And obviously part of this document particularly, but many of the other documents, that whole sense of renewal. This is a renewal of religious life in particular. How is that renewal talked about specifically in the document, and then how is that being lived in religious life in general?
That's interesting because, as we know, it was John the 23rd who started the council, but it was really Paul the 6th who saw the council through to its end and then began the implementation. And Paul the 6th was attentive to the fact that there needed to be this up-to-date renewal. And that was part of the whole document of Perfecti Caritatis, reminding all of the members of communities to look back to their foundings, look back to the original inspiration, but then make it more their own day. My own community was founded right at the time of the Reformation, and so now is nearly 500 years old. What was true at the time of the Reformation is not exactly true today. Plus, many communities were founded in Europe. How do you bring that to an American culture? Certainly, I think every community that came to America made some adaptations, but many communities also held on to European customs, and this was one of the challenges.
My own congregation is just the opposite. We were only founded in 1914, and our founder was actually at the Vatican Council, and so we were in a different situation, but nevertheless we too had to make many new adaptations. We just approved our constitutions in 1960, and we had to rechange them all over within a decade.
Now obviously the document talks about different areas of religious life. There's the monastic life, other kinds of religious communities. How specifically does the document address those areas?
Well, let's talk a little bit about what those areas are. First, there are the monastic communities. St. Benedict is the one who founded monasticism as we know it today. And the primary motivation of the life of someone who's a monastic is really prayer and contemplation and the common life around the monastery. Even for those monastics who are involved in mission, they teach or they work in a parish, their focus is really a life of prayer and the common life together. And that was for a very long time the common way of living religious life. Probably the major change to that came in about the 13th century, and the people get credit for that are St. Dominic and St. Francis, who said we ought to take, the gospel out to the world. For Dominic, it was a sense of we study not just for ourselves, but so that we can preach the gospel. And for Francis, it was to take on a radical poverty in imitation of Christ, but again to be about the work of Christ for the whole church and the whole world. That started what we would know as apostolic communities. And today, those are the religious communities that are involved in the work of the apostolate, kind of mirroring the work that the apostles took on and the work that Jesus took on in the early days. And they continue to do that. All those religious communities do have common prayer together, a common spirituality, but their focus is really mission. And what community life does and common prayer does is help to really nurture that sense of mission.
Yeah. And each of the communities would have developments over the centuries. Sometimes one apostolate would be very relevant, and they'd find out maybe perhaps we have to take on another apostolate, another mission, because the needs are changing. And that's where the leadership and the Holy Spirit, working through the ongoing leadership of the congregations, had to have an effect. And
Right.
It's interesting because in the very title, there's that sense of adaptation and renewal. So there's that whole challenge to adapt to the times, bringing it up to modern times, so to speak, but also a renewal within not only the community, but within its members itself. And so that whole thrust of the document and its charge was really there from the beginning.
Yeah, Perfecti Caritatis, perfecting love.
Right.
And that's so important in everybody's lives. And religious should be great lovers of the world and great lovers of God and great lovers of one another.
We're going to take a break in about 4 minutes or so. You want to continue that thought, and then we'll go into another topic?
One of the things I'd like to mention is, one of the key insights, I think, of all the documents comes in Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the church. And there's a section in Lumen Gentium on the call to holiness. And the document makes very clear that everyone is called to holiness. Not just religious, not just priests, not just those who are ordained. Everyone's called to holiness. That insight, I think, was part of that interior renewal for everyone, not only for religious, not only for priests, not only for bishops, but for the whole church. And I think every part of the church, fed by that movement, really came to see itself in a new way. So the whole baptismal commitment, the strength of baptism, and people responding to their baptismal call was one of the major things that came out of Vatican II, I think, and does color very much the interior renewal of religious life.
Let's get into, briefly, the structure of religious life. Let's talk a little bit about how that is set up in general, with a superior, with members, and so forth. Can you speak to that, Sister?
Sure. Every religious community does have a structure. And, on the one hand, it was organic. There were things that just rose up, especially in the beginning. But they then became regulated by the church. And over the centuries, the church has always tried to make adaptations and changes. One of the important parts is that each religious congregation, whether it's a small community of 10 or 12 members or a very large community of several thousand members, would have a religious superior. And that person is elected either by a representative of all the members or by all of the members gathered together in one body. And that person becomes the one who is in charge of all of the functions of the community.
Some of the ancient orders will have an abbot or abbess for life, and this is a very important and special role. Most other superiors, provincials, and authorities in religious life have term limits, and it's a great grace for them because they can go, wow, I got that off of my shoulders. I did my best for 3 years or 6 years or whatever the term limit is. And this also adds to the vitality and the creativity of the religious communities.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, with that structure, there are those built-in challenges, those built-in moments of renewal and adaptation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in our discussion in the second half of our show. But we're going to take a quick break.
Okay.
And we're going to, please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our show. Father Jeff and I are talking with Sister Mary McCorrmick on the document for religious life. And what we'd like to do is pick up where we left off. And we were talking about the structure, and we talked about superiors and those in charge. But one of the elements that's part of the document is some information and also some participation from the greater community in its charge and in its mission itself. Sister, would you like to talk to that?
Sure. One of the things I think that really did come out of the council and also came out of the, not only Perfecte Caritatis, but this sense of the dignity of each baptized person is the fact that every person has a responsibility. And so instead of the superior making all decisions about everything and kind of having this unilateral authority, now especially after the council, there was a much greater sense of some shared authority. Those, the superior always had a certain role, but also the responsibility that each person took for responding to God's will, being attentive to his or her own growth, own challenges. In my community, it was very typical that people taught forever in an elementary school or in a high school. And, once we became more aware of lifestyle and limitations and just your own bodily stamina, we came to recognize that maybe a 70 or 80-year-old wasn't a good first grade teacher.
Yeah.
And so you could change that. And an individual sister might be able to say, maybe I can take on some other role in the parish, in the school, but I may not be able to do kindergarten teaching anymore, and would discuss that with the superior.
Well, how important that was in understanding the document, but in also understanding one's own personal participation in community and religious life, that when they reach a certain age, that doesn't mean that ceases, but there's a renewal, there's an updating, there's some other mission and ministry that I could perform. And that's so vital, and I think that's so indicative of the document itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have religious, we'll discuss things with their provincials or superiors about assignments, about future education of the individual, etc., which never happened before. You would be surprised at what your new assignment would be because you had no input or inkling of what was coming until you got the notice from your provincial or your superior. And that was pretty rough on human nature. And people did heroic things, but it's so much better now than it was then.
I think the other reality is that in addition to the traditional works that people had always done, education, healthcare, we began to recognize in the church new ministries. And so it was often religious who were willing to take those on, to experiment with them, to try new things. And so in our own church, and we see this a lot in our diocese, among the first people who would have been directors of religious education or pastoral associates would have been religious, because the parish saw that as a new need. There wasn't anybody trained for it, but this person would take on a new job. And that was always done in consultation with the superior and a little bit with also the parish representatives and the bishop as well, and say, we're going to try something new. And, if you try to say on any one sentence, why has religious life changed so much? I think it really goes back to renewal of people's education, renewal of people's sense of their own dignity that started in the 50s, but really came to fruition in Vatican II.
And I think one of the other wonderful things about the document is that it encouraged religious communities taking a real good look at themselves. Should they continue, or is there some new communities that should develop as a result of the needs that are growing in this growing church and growing world? How is that celebrated now today in the church?
Well, some religious, in a sense, left their traditional congregations and actually found a new group with a new mission, a new spirit. Some of them really stressing more severe asceticism sometimes, other times taking on a more active role in communities, working for the poor or the marginalized, and finding their own way with new structures and new needs to be met. But that process is just at the beginning, and we're all praying for the best for all of these initiatives of the Holy Spirit.
Right. Plus, I think the more we know about history, the more we know that this has been a constant process in the church. While religious life, as Father mentioned early in the show, it's always been the background of the church. Religious life is not part of the hierarchical structure of the church. What the documents say and what most people say is religious life is a gift to the church. It's a gift of the Spirit. And it really has been part of the life of the church and added a great deal to the life of the church. But it's not an institutional part in that sense. And so some communities come into existence and live for a while and then fall out of existence. Mm-hmm. Other communities do live on generation after generation after generation. And that's part of the giftedness of the church, too. We see that in our own day. I think we're more aware of it, especially in our country with the aging of religious. But that's been a constant process of the church, and we're living through it now.
And I think hallmarks of religious life that's probably from the beginning and always has been, and perhaps always will be, are those vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And how even though those things have not changed, they have grown and renewed and been uplifted in many and varied ways. How is that being celebrated in religious life nowadays?
I think especially poverty is important. People have to see religious leading very simple, wholesome lives. Chastity, we have to be people of impeccable reputation, not simply of avoiding sin, but of being great lovers of other people, not being cold and distant, warm and friendly, but chaste. And obedience in a world that stresses self-fulfillment and being your own boss is really countercultural. And I have to say, globally, around the world, this has resonated. So you do find religious congregations flourishing in the areas where there are the poor, the needy, in Africa and Asia, etc. So we see those charisms really flourishing around the globe, even though in the United States, at the moment, we have an aging religious communities.
I think one author, in trying to reflect on the vows, starting from poverty, chastity, and obedience, talks about them and shifts the order a bit. Says that the vows are really to love, to share, and to serve. The chastity is, as Father Jeff was mentioning, it's a sense of how do we love others well. And no one person or no one family, if you're married, your dedication is to a single other person and to your own family. But a religious loves everyone, to share all of the gifts that we've been given. We don't own anything ourselves. We share everything in common, and then recognizing we share all of the resources of the earth, and then to serve. We live a life of obedience in order to serve God, to serve church, to serve the people of God and the needs of God. I think that's how it's seen today, and many people take that really seriously. Moreover, people live a vowed life not for themselves, but for the sake of God's kingdom. You know, always kind of with a mind that we do this as a foretaste of what the kingdom of God will be like.
And I'm wondering if the document itself ever thought that in years down the road that there would be people drawn to it, lay people drawn to religious life, but not necessarily becoming a vowed religious, but yet taking on the charisms and the ministry and the mission of that particular community and living that as a lay person within the church. How has that changed, and how has that been renewed in the life of the church today?
Well, there's been many third orders, you know, over the history of the church. And my own congregation is part of a family of 10 groups. Don't want to go into that here, but there's something for laity as well as vowed religious. And I think that we share our spirituality with others, and I'm certain Sister has the same experience with the Ursulines.
Right. What we have, and what many religious communities have now too, are what are called associates. They're not members. However, they are attracted to prayer and spirituality and also the service of God and God's people. And to do that with others, kind of with other like-minded people. They do it as lay people in the church. They do it in their workplace, whatever that workplace is. They may work for the church, but they may work, you know, in the business world as well. And we do see a rise in that kind of movement. And I think that, too, is one of the fruits of the council, especially that call to holiness. How do we help the laity to flourish in their holiness? And I think that's one of the gifts that religious life and religious communities can give to the laity.
As we're getting to the end of our time together, we're celebrating 50 years of Vatican II. And how are we celebrating that in light of religious life and this 50 years of celebration with the document itself on religious life and community? One
of the things I think, because I've reflected on this a lot, when the document came out, as I said, this might have been one of the, especially in the United States, one of the largest numbers of members in the church. You know, there were so many people. And today we have far fewer. I think that has been a time of purification for communities and for individual members. Many authors say that there will always be a gift of religious life to the church, but what we might have known in the 50s or the 60s was really kind of abnormal. That having smaller groups, having groups that are really committed to the church and committed to mission and ministry is probably more typical. And though it doesn't seem typical from our history, it probably is more typical. And so I think we're still living out what the council called us to, what the appropriate needs of adaptation were. And I think it'll take us another, 50 years, but another good number of years to kind of come through this so that we're on the other side of it.
Well, I think 500 years from now, there'll be religious communities, and the religious will be in those communities not because they think they can't be saints by being lay people. They know they can, but there'll be communities of people freely committing themselves without any sense of guilt or coercion to the work of God in whatever form it takes. And it's thanks to this document.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Father Jeff, Sister Mary McCorrmick, thank you very much for adding great insight into this document on religious life as we celebrate 50 years of Vatican II. Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Year of Faith, celebrating 50 years of Vatican II, is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Korda and Father Jeffrey Mickler.